back to another installment of my Rainbow for the Web tutorial series. We're going to write the JavaScript portion of our project today and connect it to our Rainbow export and HTML page. When we're finished, we will be able to fully control our sequencer for the web. The next video after this, we're going to upload actually this project to our GitHub page and be able to share that on the internet with other people. Then the last video after this one is going to be using some JavaScript libraries and other library wrappers to create a native app for our mobile devices for Android and iOS. If you stumbled upon this video just now and haven't viewed the previous videos, you might be a little lost. Please try to watch those before moving on to this current video. I really like making this type of content because it's topics that really interest me, and making tutorials that didn't exist before I started trying to learn something. If you like this type of content, make sure you like and subscribe, and let's get started. Now, before we dive into the code, I want to draw your attention to some useful links that we're going to refer to, and will help you if you want to learn more about Rainbow for the Web with Max's API or Rainbow API. The first two links, which I've included in the description, 3 links actually, is a link to the first JavaScript information about how to use Rainbow for the web. And we've talked a little bit about this in the previous videos. And the following links are having to do with parameters and imports and outports. We talked a lot about these in the first couple of videos when we were actually making the Max patch or the Rainbow export. And imports and outports and parameters, like a typical Max patch, are our avenues to get data into our Rainbow device or our Rainbow export. If you can remember, we first created some objects here that are import, param, and then some outports. So we have an output here, which is track2 values and track1 values, and we were able to name specific attribute objects when we attached it to our Rainbow that matched up with the names that we created so that we could send data in. I'm going to delete that because we don't need that. And based on how we named things in our Rainbow export, those names are now going to be variables that we're going to be using to route that data from our JavaScript into our Rainbow export. So a few ways to do this is to use the import and outports or use params. One way to think about these are imports are one-way avenues for data to flow in, and outports are one way for data to flow out. We could send control data into our Rainbow device, and we can have feedback values come out, and maybe that just gives us numbers or information, or we could use it to drive some other sorts of visuals if we wanted to. Params are ways that we can send data in and then also get information back about that particular param. They behave in the same way in that we need to know the names, and we can refer back to our Rainbow patch, or we can find them within the JavaScript, and I'll show you how to do that later on. But if you want to see more information about how to follow the patterns of sending data into our Rainbow device, these 2 links are going to be really, really helpful. Let's look at this first one just for the sake of examples, and we're going to talk about this device. Basically, we're going to create a Rainbow device, and we'll be able to draw from that device properties, in particular the names of our parameters, so that we can address them as variables in our JavaScript to get the name, then also change the values of the parameters that we have. Let's say it's the tempo, and then we can also get information about what is the current tempo and display that on our HTML page. The patterns are pretty similar in the imports and the outports. We just need to be aware of how to address those. And so we're going to create a new message event and then say how much time ahead, the import or the output name, and then the values here. So within the code, we're going to talk about how to use these, but I wanted to point these out on the web, that these are great references that will help you if you have a different sort of project. There was one change I need to add before we start implementing the JavaScript code, is that we need to update our new.html page, and we're going to add these lines to our code. And there's just 4 lines, but if you don't want to copy paste or type these out based on your screen, then there's a link in the description of the video that is to a Github Gist, and if you click on it, it's going to take you to this certain page, and you can copy all of that text or go to raw and highlight it all, select all, copy, and paste it into your new.html. It's going to be the same thing that I'm going to be working with right now, and it adds these lines of code and also references the seek_app. So now we're going to remind ourselves about what our HTML page looked like, how we ended it in the previous video, and we are going to start altering our JavaScript and make it connect to our HTML page. So going back to Visual Studio Code, your environment should look something like this. I'm going to close some of my tabs and start fresh and point us to where we should be looking. Your environment should look something like this. And we had been changing the new HTML page because we wanted to keep the templated index.html. When we're finished with the set of videos, we are going to delete these old ones and rename them to index so that we just have the index as our main page that loads. And one difference that we changed was that we had originally it was app.js, and that was the JavaScript file that we were going to use, but we wanted to point it to a separate one because for the same reasons we wanted to maintain our original app.js unchanged. We're going to delete this and rename things when we're finished, but I didn't want to override some of the templated stuff. And so we had this as seek_app, and the seek_app should be the original version of it. If it is some sort of altered version, what we're going to do is we're just going to jump to the app.js, copy that, and go to seek_app and paste it in here just in case we overrode some stuff, because I want to start from scratch first, and then we're going to talk about what we're going to keep and not keep. I'm going to adjust my windows so that we can have this page right here and come over like this. I've already started my live server, and just as a quick reminder, one way to do that is in the previous video we had an extension that we used, and it was, I think, the Go Live extension or live server. Yeah, I think it was the live server that we downloaded. If you haven't done that, then please install that, and it should provide with you this Go Live option here. And I'm going to start it again, and it should load up this HTML page, which actually is the index.html. It doesn't say that, but by default that's what it looks for, and we are going to be altering the new.html. So I'm going to close this because I already have that new open, but make sure that if you have this linked up, you should be going to 127.0.0.1 : whatever port is written here on your bottom side of your screen. 5500 is likely the default, and then go to new.html. And your page should look like this if you've been following along, and we are going to be altering our seek.app.js. And let's look at some of these things. We're going to look at some of the built-in functionality and talk about what is important to our project and what we're going to keep and not keep. So as a quick review, there's a main function that is the setup function. The name is right here, and this describes the the type of code and how it runs. And so it's an async function named setup with no parameters. And this actually runs down a bit of the code base. And one way to see how big a function is inside VS Code, I'm going to adjust our windows, is we can go to this little caret that appears when I mouse over this portion, and I can click on this and it collapses all of the code in that main bracket right here. So it runs between lines 1 and 107. And then we have other functions that we are going to be using. There are some important ones that we're going to keep and some that we're not going to be keeping. If we slide all the way down, there's a bunch of other functions that come along with this template for Rainbow for the web. And we go all the way down, the code actually starts to execute the setup function here. And within the rest of the original setup code block, they call various functions that are named here, like load presets, make MIDI keyboard, etc. So I'm going to scroll all the way back to the top and reveal this setup function, and we're going to talk about what's going to be important and what we're going to keep for our code. This first line points the JavaScript to the existing Rainbow export, and oops, don't want to do that. I'm trying to open up this window a little bit. If we look at our export folder, it should match up with this URL destination. So export and then patch.export.json. That is our Rainbow export data. We load a web audio context. Web audio is a outside library that allows us to have audio, and Rainbow export taps into that capability and talks to each other, and we connect what we call nodes to into an audio graph that is basically an audio chain, a signal chain that might take an input, controls, processing, and then a destination, most likely our speakers, and we have to connect the whole context together. So context could be a container of those nodes, and a few lines here basically are connecting those sorts of inputs and outputs. So we're going to keep all this code. From here, from lines 12 to 42, is basically drawing that information from our Rainbow export at this location and making sure that works, and it'll throw some errors if it cannot find that information. Moving down to lines 45, down to about here, 45 to 54, this chunk of code has to do with dependencies. And dependencies are regarding when we first made our Max project, whether or not we were going to use other outside files, let's say samples. And it would look first at, do you have this file in the exports folder, which is called dependencies? And if you have information on here, it's going to try to load those samples, those audio files, and make them ready for our JavaScript to load and possibly future play or take information to do some processing. In our case, for our Rainbow project, we did not have any existing files that we want to draw in, and so we see this array that is just empty. Further on down is to create the device. And so the device is a name for our Rainbow export that has information about doing some input and processing and then output. And this is really crucial to keep because it's going to run some Rainbow-based methods to load up our device. I'm going to call this device over and over again later on in the code. Further on down, we have this load samples, and we don't actually have any samples. Like I mentioned before, we don't have any dependencies, and so if we did have samples that we need to load, then this is the time that it would load these files into our buffers that we could possibly use for playback or processing or information, drive some other sorts of audio processing. The last important thing about this is that this device node.connect is basically, if we think about the audio chain, signal chain, we are connecting our device to the output node, which is, if we go up a little bit higher, we created this variable around here. Basically, this output node is connecting our context to the destination. So we can think about the destination could be our speakers. And so our device is our rainbow export, and we're connecting to the context and pointing it towards our speakers. And so everything up here is really, really important. The few things that we're not going to use is the dependencies. We're not going to use dependencies, and you can comment these out. It's not a big deal if we don't comment those out, but we wouldn't be using dependencies, and we wouldn't be using loading the samples. Those things are basically empty. We're not using any of those things, and so it's not relevant for us to run that code. We have this area that says extract the name, rainbow version. For our code, it's not that important because we're going to have a fancier name. We don't need to say that this is rainbow version, blah, blah, blah. And we could comment that out if we wanted to as well. Some things that we don't need, some things that we don't need in our code here is we don't need to make sliders, and we could comment that out. We don't need to make an import form. So there's some nice templated functionality here. If we look at the original, I'm going to copy this and create a new page and just look at the original template. This area here, this imports, basically looks at our rainbow export and sees, oh, what imports do we have? And we're going to create a little drop down. And we could send in some data into our our rainbow patch, kind of like what we would here. So I'll draw the analogy here. So we have these sliders that we can send values in, and you can see that we have some outports that are telling us the values that have come through our rainbow patch, and we could just type in numbers. And this is sort of the reason that we have graphical UI, so that we don't have to type in numbers. It's more fun to have these sliders to have those values go in there. And so those values we would type in here. But the reason I'm showing you this is that this make import form is a function that exists further on down the code. It's right here at line 223 for me. And basically what it does it finds a portion of our HTML page and assigns some variables. But most importantly, it goes to our rainbow object and our device and looks for the imports and builds this drop-down menu for us. We don't need to do this because we don't want to have a drop-down menu. We've created these sliders to do that sort of functionality for our imports. And for our project, we won't need this make import form. And so we could comment this portion out from lines 223 to 262. Make sure that we're addressing this code block, and we could comment that out. We don't need to comment it out because it's not going to really do anything, but we should be commenting out this portion right around here, make import form. Attach outports is going to be a useful thing because going back to our Max original rainbow patch, we had a few outports. We had this outport track 1 values and then this other track 2 values, and that was useful for us because we thought that it would be helpful for when we send values in to get this information out just as a sort of debugging sort of thing. And we can remove that functionality later when we know that everything works, but to be able to see it come out, we can see that I just sent in some values for our value 2 sliders, and these are value 1 sliders, that we can get that information from our HTML page as well, as long as we attach these attach outports function here. We're not using any presets, so we can comment out that line, and we're not using make MIDI keyboard either. We're not using any external device that is going to be sending MIDI information into our rainbow export. We can go down and comment out those functions that we had here. We're keeping attach outports if we wanted to, and we could truncate this make MIDI keyboard and then comment that out because we're not using that. it doesn't hurt if you don't comment out this make MIDI keyboard, because we're not actually calling that function, and we're not using this one either. So from lines 289 to 310, we could comment this out. Going up a little bit higher, we are going to notice that we have this load rainbow script, and this is actually a function that exists later down in the code. If we scroll down, the meat of that function is right here, and it's important that we keep that here because it is where it pulls in the version and tries to make sure that it has access to the rainbow library to take the export and load it properly. So we're going to keep that there. Let's scroll back up to this area right here. And one thing that we want to make sure that we never comment out is this document.body on click, because one of the rules for web audio is we cannot allow web audio devices to automatically make sound. They have to be started or resumed based on user input. And so oftentimes you have to click on something or scroll, press a UI element to be able to start the audio. Hardly ever should you ever be able to open up a web page and music automatically sounds. That's part of the rules of web audio. And the way we get around this is that we can have a simple function like this, and that basically says the document, which is the HTML page, in the body. If we notice an on-click, this is an on-click event, then we will tell the context, which is the container for our web audio, to resume. And so that basically says, if you are not playing sound already, enable sound and start playing that sound that you're supposed to be playing. And if we don't have this, even if we connect all the rest of the code together with JavaScript and we forget to have this line of code, or if we accidentally deleted it or commented it out, the audio will not play because we need to tell the context to resume. Super, super important. We're going to keep this set of guardrails on here because this lets us know if the rainbow patch is not properly loaded, and these couple lines of code is going to allow us to let us know when everything is working properly. So if we just hit save now and go to our HTML page, we are going to, I'm going to move this over. I'm going to remind you how to open up our JavaScript console. I'm using Safari, and the tools are the same for Chrome. You can go to View and I'm sorry, for Safari we go to Develop and go to View JavaScript Console. And this will open up a portion of your browser, and it might throw some errors if you're looking at it. We're basically looking for errors or feedback that we've programmed out. I'm going to close my Grammarly because we don't need that at the moment, and I'm going to reload the page. So if things are not working properly in JavaScript, oftentimes it'll let you know that with this sort of stop sign with an exclamation mark, unhandled promise error, null is not an object, and it'll tell you the line. So it'll tell you the file that has the error on it, and then colon with these numbers here. This points at around where the error occurred. Okay, so if we go over here, it says around line 72, there's null is not an object, and so it's trying to do some code that it can't identify. So for here, this says extract the name of the rainbow version for the patch for the description. And oh, I mentioned earlier that we don't need this code. It's a good idea to comment this out. And so we're going to comment that out. Basically what this error is saying is it's looking within the document, which is referring to our HTML page, and trying to find the ID of a patcher-title. And in our code here, we don't have any IDs that refer to that name. Remember when we spent a lot of time creating different ID names, particularly for our sliders and maybe our tempo start? All of those things are really important because JavaScript can find those elements based on those names, but if it looks through the document and can't find something that it thinks is there based on this name, it'll throw an error and say that, oh, I can't find it, and then actually not be able to execute the rest of the code because it threw an error. So it tried to find this thing and then tried to update up update this text area with the name or the version of our rainbow patch. And since this ID did not exist within the HTML page, it threw the error. So we're going to comment this out, hit save, and you'll notice that that error disappeared, and the line that says seek app 105 is where it's the end of this setup function. So basically it ran through the entire setup method and we got to patcher loaded successfully question mark and gave us the context of our audio. If we expand this area right here, this can be useful, and don't be daunted by this sort of information. There's a lot of information here. It tells us about the audio context, right? And so this is part of the web audio aspect of our patch, and it lets us know that the state is currently suspended. Remember when we said that the web audio context has to be started based on user input. And so when I reloaded this page, I'm gonna hit reload, it'll say that the state is suspended. Later on, what we could do is after we click into this page, we can check for whether the context has resumed or not. And so we can do something like this, context dot, I think, state. So I'm going to hit save, and it should have this functionality. We said that if we click on it, this is on click event, we can click into this page. It should give us a new line from the console to say whether the context is suspended or resumed or started. So I'm going to click in here. It did say suspended, and I clicked on it again, and it is running. It may be that that first time it took a moment for it to resume. What we could do is something like set timeout, and we're going to call a handler to wait a certain amount of time. So something like this. And we are going to wait maybe like 100 milliseconds to see if the context has started. So I'm going to eliminate this first line, and we're going to click on the screen, and then it'll arrive at this chunk of code. It'll wait 100 milliseconds and then spit out the context. So clicking, we can see that it is running now. I'm going to reload it one more time. Click, it is running. I'm going to re-add the original context.state, and we should be able to see that when I click on it, it's going to tell us the current state, attempt to resume it, and then give us the new context state. So it was suspended, it'll run the context.resume, and then now the context is running. So that means if we had audio working, then it should be making sound at that time. So this sort of set timeout is a way to delay a function call or method within a certain amount of delay time. We don't need to have these elements right here anymore because we know that that part is working. And then we can move on to the next portion of our code. All right, at this point we are ready to alter our seek.app to add the new content in there. And I was sort of going back and forth about what would be the most useful way to go about this, and I've decided that I'm going to share a link with you all for you to copy and paste, and then we'll go through the portions of it that I find really, really valuable and something that you can take and use in the future, and then also understand what's going on with our current project. So in the description of our video, the links are to two GitHub Gists, and this first one is going to be the app.js or the seek_app.js. And what you can do is once you navigate to that page, it should look something like this, seek_app.js, and you can select it all, or you can go to raw and then select it here. This is probably the easiest way. And then go to your seek_app and paste the contents in there. And it should be about 285, 286 lines of code. And it should contain the code that I wrote for our particular web application, and it has also removed the other code that I said earlier in this video that was unnecessary. And let's go through the top now and go through some of the portions that I think are going to be really helpful. And I'm going to move the page over here like this so we can see this, and I'm going to hide the Explorer because we're only just looking at the seek_app now. I still have all the important bits from the top, the URL, the web context that we create, connecting the end nodes to our context, the error catches for our Rainbow export, creating the device, which is really important, connecting the output of our device to our web audio context destination, and then attaching our outports. And then there's some code right here that allows us to check to see what our imports are. So remember that at this point, when we've loaded this, we have this device, which is our Rainbow export. And in that has our information from our original patching that contains things like our import names, our param names, our output names, and that allows us to do a pattern that looks at our HTML page and allows my code to match up the JavaScript with the HTML elements, so that connects if we change a slider and to send that information into our Rainbow patch. And this chunk of code is going to be really, really useful because it allows me to see, does the Rainbow patch understand all the imports and the outports and the params that we created. So if I reload here and I open up this portion, we should be able to see the lines 66, 67, if it's spitting out that information. Yeah, so I asked it to tell me what the imports that or the parameters that we think are associated with our Rainbow export. And you can see here that it is spitting out things like track 2 volume, the beats, and track 1, and this should all match up with the import names that we created here. So we can see tempo and beat, those sorts of things. And so it seems to be working. And we can go down here. I've created some function calls, and I have the code lower in this file. Basically, it's setting up our start and stop, setting up our melody sliders, which is this area right here, our rhythm sliders, and our volume sliders. So there's a section that sets up these sliders right here. That's the melody sliders. And another section that sets up our rhythm sliders here. Matches up here with our HTML, and then our volume sliders here. And then we also have a section that sets up our tempo. So I can change the tempo here to change the speed of our sequencer. This chunk of code here, 95 on, was originally a part of the template, which we're keeping because it loads up our Rainbow script. And then for each section, you'll notice that I commented out this area that says set up melody sliders, set up rhythm sliders, and if we look at this code, it's basically the same two things. One refers to the melody, one refers to the rhythm. And what it does is it looks at our document, which is referring to our HTML page. I'm going to open this up so that we can split this view. You can right click on this and you can say that I want to split it to the right, and it's going to move it over. And that way we can look at two different files at the same time. Another way to do this is I'm going to close this new one, and we can just pull this tab and bring it over to the side like this. And so we're examining this setup melody sliders function, and what it does is I create a empty container and of an array, and it goes through my document. So this document is a generic term for the HTML page that this JavaScript is being loaded into, and it looks for elements by a certain ID. Remember in previous videos we talked about adding an ID or a class name to elements, and that way it allows us to search and find the specific element in the code. And so if we look here, it's going to be looking for a templated name, says melody slider, and here with $i, you can think about it as a variable replacement. And since this is in a for loop, we're starting from values 1 through 9. And so for each iteration, it's going to be looking for melody slider dash 1, melody slider dash 2, all the way from numbers 1 through 9. And it matches up with these elements right here. So this input element is melody slider dash 1, melody slider dash 2. And this code repeats itself through all of the slider names and adds a reference to each specific slider to this melody sliders array. And then for each slider, let's say for this one, we're going to start here. Then for each slider, it's going to say when on input, which is an event listener, when I move one of the sliders on the web page here, depending on which one it is going to take the values of all of the sliders together, because this is melody sliders, and what it does is it takes all of the values of each slider and then sends it over to my track 1 import. So this send message to import is a function that I wrote that basically follows the API, the Rainbow API, and sends it to the import name of track 1. So if we think about the analog for Max, we have this track 1 import right here. The outside of that patch was originally this area right here. So when I change the values, it's sending all of the slider values like this, those decimal values together. It needs to receive all those values together, and it routes it through track 1. And so we're doing the analog with the JavaScript, and it's every time we make one change for one slider, it's going to send all of the values to that track 1 import. You can see here that once I move this, the JavaScript console is saying that, oh, the values that I'm sending over is 0.660000. And if I change a value here, then it's changing 0.660000.810. And this is following that pattern that I had the Rainbow for Web API. And the same thing is happening over here for the setup rhythm sliders. It is finding all the rhythm slider values from 1 through 9 and saying that if we happen to change a value on any of these 9 sliders, or 8 sliders rather, 8 sliders, then we are going to send those values, the collective set of values, over to the import of track 2, like we would in Max. So here we have this track 2 import, and when that value comes in, then that changes those values for our sequencer. Next two things that we're going to look at is setup, start, stop. And setup, start, stop starts by trying to find the tempo toggle ID element. And so I'm going to copy this and go to our HTML page and find that element here. So that's basically what it's doing. It's saying document, find that ID. It is this input right here, this checkbox. And it's going to say that if we happen to click on it, this is an on-click event, then we're going to send a message to our Rainbow device, which is linked to the transport toggle element. And so where's the transport toggle element? Here, import transport toggle. And so if we happen to click on it, it's going to send a value into this area and hopefully start and stop our transport. The way that it looks in our JavaScript is if we happen to click on it, then it's going to compare the current state of our checkbox. And if it is checked, then it'll send that true value into the Rainbow And if it's unchecked, then it's going to send the untrue value and turn off our transport. And if you have uploaded this, then we can test this out by making sure that you have saved your file. Remember that if we make a change to our file and VS Code thinks that it's unsaved, then we'll see this yellow dot that appears. If you make a change and then save it, then this white dot disappears. And it says that we've saved all those elements, and since our Go Live server is reloading the page when we do that, then we should be able to have all the functionality that we've been talking about. So the start is on by default, and if we slide up and have our volume slider up, then we should be able to hear some audio right now. I think that this is all connected. We should be able to hear audio now from my output. I'm going to bring it down so that that should have gone away. So we were able to change the values of our rhythm sliders or melody sliders, and let's go look at the tempo. Set tempo is right here, and it's trying to find that tempo text. This is where we can change the values. So it looks for that tempo text element in our HTML page, which is a little bit above where we were just looking, and it assigns it to this reference variable right here. It'll find that value, and if we make a change to it, I have some code that just makes sure that it happens to be a number. If it doesn't happen to be a number, then it just goes back to the previous value that we had before. We have some max and min values that we have set. It is 140 and 40, and so if it happens to be outside of those boundaries, then it'll set it to the minimum or it'll set it to the maximum. From there, we will change that value in the Rainbow device based on the value that we have here. So we have this tempo state, and we have this get parameter method that I wrote. And let's quickly look at that over here. So this get parameter here basically says in the Rainbow device, we have a certain parameter, and I want to change that value based on the parameter name. And so this bit of code right here looks through all the parameters within our Rainbow device, and if the name matches, then we will be able to change that value after we get a reference to it. So we go and try to find the tempo parameter, and then we associate it with tempo state variable. When we change the value in that text box, it'll assign it here in the tempo state dot value. So let's have some audio playing. Currently the tempo is 120. Let's change it to something obvious, something like 40 is our minimum value. I just hit enter. Should be able to hear the tempo change. Let's bring up some rhythm stuff. We should be able to hear those as well. We can slide our volume. If you happen to So now let's double check the start stop. We have the tempo currently set at 120. Let's have some activity to see if we can hear it. And if we hit this checkbox, audio should stop. Start it again. Start, stop. Seems like this is all working. Let's go and look at the set of code that we added to our HTML page and see what it's actually doing. I'm looking at lines 218 and 221 for our web page, the new.html, and it is here to allow us to get some feedback for when we change the values. And you can see here when I move my sliders, it is sending the values like we normally see on our Max page. when I go something like this, then this track 1 values come out, and when I make a value change here, you can see that the value 1s come out. When I make a change here to value 2, then track 2 values should also be spitting out here. And so this is all happening from this attach outports method that's part of the template that came out with the Rainbow for Web from Cycling. And what it does is, if we look at this set of code, is it looks at our device, checks for the outports, and for each outport, when we have something that a value changes, then we subscribe to having those values be updated to our HTML elements. And you can see here we have this rainbow console.div, right? Where is it actually looking for it? Here. It actually finds the rainbow console readout div, and you can see it right here. It finds that element and then updates the text within it. If I reload the page, rainbow output readout, and replaces the text here that is set by default when we first load the page with the incoming output text. So by default, when it hasn't received any changes that are coming out of our output, then when I click on something, you can see that it changed to replace that text that was originally rainbow output readout with the text 1 values. I'm going to do it one more time. When we don't change anything, the code has run and is waiting for an update from our 2 output values, and when those values do change, then it will replace the text right here, like that. Let's say that we are using this mainly for a debugging tool and we don't really need this when we ship. We can remove this chunk of code right here by commenting it out or deleting it, and then we can also go to the top of our code, near the top of our code actually, and comment out the attach outports. And so for me it's line 62. We could remove that portion, and when we comment out this code, everything will behave the same way, and we won't see any of that feedback because it was mainly for debugging. I think for right now everything is working. We can hear everything. We're going to pause for right now and say that this portion of the tutorial is finished, and the next video that we're going to work on is going to be pushing this application to GitHub pages so that you can share it with other people, and then the following video will be using some JavaScript and other wrapper libraries to export this for a mobile phone natively, so it could be Android or iOS. If you have any comments or questions, please post them onto this video. Thanks again. Make sure you like and subscribe. See you all later.